apologize for rushing you and dinging the bell, but we have so many speakers, I don't want you to miss any of the excellent content. If you, I would encourage you to get your headsets. We may have some Portuguese speakers, so if you don't speak Portuguese, get a headset. And if you don't speak English, you don't know what I'm saying, but get a headset. Okay. Okay. This was funny. You can say it in Portuguese.
Gente, a palestra agora vai ser tanto em português quanto em inglês, então quem não entender inglês é melhor pegar os fones de ouvido, senão vai ficar meio perdido.
Okay. So my name is Mike Donnelly, and I will be your host for this afternoon's workshop to regulate or not regulate. What is the role of the state in home education? And also, we will talk about whether homeschooling or home education should be considered a human right. We'll be continuing a conversation that we had earlier today with some of our panelists. I will note that if you're looking in the book, you will note that we have some different panelists. Unfortunately, as you know, the Congress people, the deputies, are not able to join us today, so I have called on some of my distinguished colleagues to fill in their place, and frankly, they'll probably do a better job. Be a more stimulating discussion. Okay, so I would like to introduce our first guest who will give a lecture is Professor Dr. Ingo Richter, who is a law professor at the Berlin Free University and Hamburg University. He has taught law at Stanford University, Hastings Law School, the University of Chicago, Smith College, Bordeaux, and Tunis. He's been a member in several educational reform commissions. He's a past director of the German Youth Institute in Munich. He is the current editor of the journal Recht der Jugend und des Bildungswesen. It's my best German. He is the author of numerous books and articles on constitutional law and educational law, holds a doctorate in law from Hamburg University and in Paris, is from Germany. He's a German. One of the few German law professors who is willing to even talk about the topic of home education. And so I'm very, very pleased. I'd like to say Ingo's a friend. I've known him for about 5 or 6 years. He's just a giant intellect, has a gigantic intellect, knows the law so well, not just German law, but constitutional law, brilliant scholar, and we were just delighted, so delighted to have him here to share with us. He's going to give us a lecture for about 12 minutes, and then we'll bring up our next speaker. So please welcome Professor Dr. Ingo Richter.
Do you have to do?
So you just talk, you
and then
push that button there,
yeah.
and
Okay, yeah. So, good afternoon, everybody. Indeed, I have to confess, I'm German, so, but I'm not from Karlsruhe, the Constitutional Court, and I will not speak about this. Now I will speak about human rights and a new foundation for homeschooling in human rights, which I find in the best interest of the child as protected by the Convention on the Rights of the Child of 1989 by the UN. So please have a look at this basic article. State parties recognize the right of the child to education, that's clear. But then it comes. In all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, the best interest of the child shall be a primary consideration. And that's really very important. These two words, primary consideration. So these two articles can indeed if correctly interpreted, the basis for a new approach to a human right-based theory of homeschooling. Very often, too often, the right to education is interpreted as a right of the child to state education in public schools. This is not correct. It's legally not correct. The legal structure of the child-parent-state relationship must be seen as follows. According to Article 18 CRC, that's the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the parents have the primary responsibility for upbringing and developing this child. And upbringing and development also means education. But the state can restrict this fundamental responsibility of the parents by imposing compulsory education. And Article 28 of the CRC asks the state to do so. But if the education of the child is a primary responsibility of the parents, the right to education of the child is a primary right of the child to education by his or her parents. The right of the child to get education from the parents is the primary right of the child. You have to keep this in mind. It's very important. And it's not the way it is normally seen in law. And this means that, and I read very slowly now, education at home, if and as far as the state does not impose compulsory education in schools, is a human right. The basis is the human right, and secondly, the state can impose, under certain conditions, compulsory education. In educating the children, the parents also have to respect the best interests of the child. As Article 18 CRC puts it, the best interest of the child is the parents' basic concern. The notion primary consideration is very often misunderstood, as it is here. It does not mean, as for instance the German translation says, vorrangige Berücksichtigung. It means that the administration, the judge, the school principal, the teachers have to look first at the best interest of the child and weigh this interest against other responsibilities. It does not mean that the child's interest has to prevail in any case. State legislatures of the member states of the CRC have to take the best interest of the child into consideration when they make new school law. And they have to examine whether homeschooling or schooling in public or private schools is in the best interest of the child. This is completely new. Until now, there is no constitutional obligation that the state legislature has to ask the question, is public or private schooling in the best interest of the child or homeschooling? In general, state legislatures do not do this. But if they don't do it, they violate the CRC. They violate international law. So this is a very important constitutional requirement for the procedure of legislating. As I said, it is possible that the state imposes compulsory education, particularly in primary education, but under certain conditions also in secondary education. But This does not mean, compulsory education does not mean that there are no exceptions. Exceptions particularly means that if there are fundamental rights of the parents of the child, then the state legislature has to allow homeschooling, home education, to allow exceptions. And there are two possible rights which stand in the foreground. First, the freedom of religion, and second, the freedom of conscience. With the freedom of religion, it's difficult because, as far as I know, there's no religion in the world which forbids compulsory schooling as such. There can be situations when schooling is compulsory which are against the freedom of religion. We know all this from sex education and co-educative sports and so on. But if the state introduces compulsory education, it's a state obligation to find solutions for this kind of conflict. And if the state, the school, cannot find solutions which are acceptable as well to the parents, the children, and the state interest, then the freedom of religion, the freedom of conscience has to prevail. But freedom of conscience does not mean that I restrict myself saying, oh, that's my conscience. And this would not be enough. Conscience has not to be proven. Conscience cannot be proven. But the parents have to demonstrate that they live on their convictions, on the basis of their convictions. If they can show that they respect certain rules and they want to apply these rules also to their children, then they are to be believed. The administration, the school principal, has to say, yes, I have to accept that's your conscience. And there's a famous saying of Martin Luther in 15-something when he stood before all the cardinals of Rome in the city of Worms. And he just said 3 words, Ich kann nicht anders. I cannot do otherwise. That's my conviction. So if it's plausible that the parents can say that, ich kann nicht anders, I must, then this has to be accepted by the state administration because the conscience cannot be forced. I was talking about making new school law, and that the parliaments are obliged to ask and answer the question whether for the certain group of children, certain categories of children, schooling, being private or public, or home education would be better. Not only this, but we as researchers have the task to look at the existing school law, not only new school laws. We have to do research on the existing school laws, whether in these laws this question, schooling or home education, has been a topic. And this is, as there are millions of school laws probably in the world, a task for a century, I would say. And now comes the practical question. When school administrators, school principals, and supervisors implement school law, they also have to give primary consideration to the best interest of the child. Because this Article 3 of the CRC applies also to the administration, not only to the legislature. And this means that before enrolling a child in a public or private school, they, the administrators, have to strike a balance between home and school education. This is at the basis of schooling in everyday education, very, very important. I think there are not very many school principals, teachers, or school administrators who really ask the question when they see a child and the parents, is it for this particular child better to go to school or better to be home educated? And in this respect, they have to look at the home education, at the home situation, at the neighborhood, at the relatives, at the money, at the e-equipment, the digital equipment of the home. And they also have to look at the teachers of that school. And it can be, and every school administrator knows this, that's a bad school. And particularly for this child, it would be better to be home educated. So these are single educational decisions, and they have to be made in the individual case. And as we all know, to decide this is important for the whole life of this child. If I look at these obligations of the legislature, of the researchers to look at the existing school law, and of the administrators and the principals in the everyday situation. The rights of the child are in a very, very strong position because of this notion, primary consideration. The parents' rights are also guaranteed by international law, of course. But there is not a notion like this primary consideration of the parents' rights. International law does not say that the parents' rights are of primary consideration. They are rights. They have to be respected. And if they are in conflict with the children's rights, then there has to be mitigation. But the position of the child is stronger than the position of the parents. And therefore, my advice for the homeschooling movement would be to change the impact, to stress more children's rights and less parents' rights. But that's my personal opinion, and most of you will not agree because you're parents. Last point, looking at all this, there is a lot of work before us. This new approach must be needs further research. I think we should try to set up a model school law where what I'm asking for, this consideration of the rights of the child, is shown how it works. Second, as I said, research on existing school law is necessary. And then we should have some examples, some school law cases, and see whether the rights of the child have been taken into account or not. That's it. Thank you.
Ingo, don't run away. Does anyone have a question? We have to grill you a little bit. Okay, we have a question. Dos microfones, por favor. Yeah. Yes, right here. Yeah. And we'll let you have the other
I
one.
just had a simple question. I wanted to know if he's a parent. Can you tell us about your family?
Here comes the other microphone. Yeah.
You a parent?
Good.
I'm married now to the same woman for 48 years, and we have 7 grandchildren. And as our son has 3 daughters, I think there will be some more.
Anybody else have a question for Ingo? Any questions? I so appreciate Ingo's creative thinking he's a problem solver. And I, I appreciate this innovative way of looking at this idea. As an American, we have not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so this conversation does not affect America specifically, but as an advocate for homeschooling globally, I appreciate this new way of thinking, and I'm very excited because, all the other countries have signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so if it is binding on them, then we need to use that kind of language in the international law context, along with other arguments. But I appreciate that Ingo is putting his intellect against this question, so I appreciate that. Boe?
Yeah, no, it was a fascinating lecture for me, and this is for South Africa very applicable because the South African Constitution says explicitly, in matters considering the child's interests are of paramount importance. So it just says exactly the same. But then the next question comes as, how does the process work to determine what's in the best interest of the child? Can you maybe comment on that?
You want to be practical, huh? We have maybe one question more if anybody has one. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the information that there is this notion in the South African Constitution. I have to say I was not aware of it, so I will look it up and look at the literature. Nobody knows what is in the best interest of the child as such, of course. I suspect that even in the individual case, there can be different opinions what is in the best interest of the child, and very often there are. But if this is so, the law is very, very clear. It is the parents who have to decide first what is in the best interest of the child. And only when the youth administration can prove that there is neglect, there is misuse of the parents' rights, so they have to prove that, then this definition, or the first right of the parents to define what the best interest of the child is restricted by the state youth administration. But this is an exception. Yeah? It's not the other way around, that the state administration can come and say, oh, the best interest of the child is so and so and so. No. And a difficult question is, if there is doubt that the parents act in the best interest of the child, it's the only way the state administration can act is to take away custody. This is the normal process. They look for foster care or whatsoever, or take it over the custody themselves. The youth administration would be the decision to order schooling for homeschooled children, or the other way around. The other way around is also possible, to order homeschooling for children in public schools. Yeah? Because it's in the best interest of the child. If this also is a possible decision, until now it is not. Until now, the sharp edge is custody or not custody. And I think this really very difficult and very often bad decision, because if you have only to say custody or not custody, that's really a sharp decision. I think the decision to homeschool or to go to a private school or to a public school, this is to get more possibilities to do the best for the interests of the child.
A little short on time, so we'll let Jan go, and there'll be some more discussion time.
Yeah, short, Ingo. Do you know that one of my PhD students finished a doctoral thesis from South Africa in the best interest of the child according to the South African Constitutional Court decisions? Do realize that the court decisions of that court are worldwide highly appreciated as the most innovative court decisions worldwide. And again, there, South African should take the lead in reflection on many items. Can I raise? Well, I have several questions to raise, but just limited to two. We do it in private later on, Ingo. First, I quote your paper, the state legislator of the member states of the Convention on Children's Rights have to take the best interest of the child into consideration when they make new school law. That's perfect, but then. And they have to examine whether homeschooling or schooling in public or private schools is in the best interest of the child. My question is, I'm not convinced. I would be convinced that the school law will enable the parent to make choices, and that eventually the frame, some basic norms should be articulated in the school law, but it is not up to the legislator to make choices, to enable parents to make choices. Isn't that your position?
The legislature has the task to name the conditions which are important for individual choice. Of course, the legislature, the parliament, does not make choice itself. It's impossible, of course not. But choice is the task of the parents. They have to choose, of course. But the legislature can, and I think must, under international law, name the criteria for this kind of choice parents make.
I agree, but so you do not agree anymore with that sentence, namely, and they have, the legislature, have to examine whether homeschooling or schooling in public or private schools is in the best interest of the child.
Yes, it
Should
is
nuance,
too short.
nuance
This is
too.
too short.
Yes, okay.
They
And on
have to
second,
examine and name the criteria.
exactly, yeah, but the choice will be in parents' hands, right?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Now, second question. In another text you prepared for this conference, you refer to Article 28 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Do we agree that Article 28 is not referring to primary and secondary schooling, but to primary education and forms of education?
To my knowledge, I cannot agree. I have to study it. Because I saw what you wrote in your paper, and I do not have the documents with me. I could have looked it up in the
I can
internet,
show
but I didn't. So I'm free to agree when I have had a look at it.
This is what happens when you have two lawyers that are researchers arguing about an issue. Thank you very much. Ingo, please thank Dr. Richter. That was excellent, Ingo. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Okay, so now we will welcome our next speaker. Lindsey Burke researches and writes on federal and state education issues as the Will Skillman Fellow in Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation in the United States. Lindsey focuses on two critical areas of education policy: reducing the federal role in education and empowering families with school choice. Her work and commentary have been cited in or appeared in national magazines, newspapers, and other digital venues. She also appears on numerous national, regional radio and television programs. Lindsey has a bachelor's degree in politics from Hollins University and a Master of Teaching degree in Foreign Languages education from University of Virginia. What language? Français. Jan, elle parle français. Parfait, oui, mais bien. She and her husband, Brian, currently reside in Alexandria, Virginia. Lindsey is a friend. I have so appreciated the opportunity to get to know her over the last several years. She is brilliant and a real passionate and persuasive defender of freedom for education. Please welcome Lindsey Burke.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that very much, and thank you all for being here today. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach to talking about homeschooling today and filter it through the lens of what we know about what regulations have done to private school choice programs in the states. And when I talk about private school choice programs, I primarily mean options like vouchers, tuition tax credit scholarships, the new cool kid on the block, which is known as education savings accounts in the state. So I'm going to filter our conversation about homeschooling through that lens today. So as homeschooling and school choice programs advance throughout the U.S., so should proponents' considerations of the regulatory landscape in which those options exist. And so today what I want to do specifically is talk about some lessons that we can learn from what has happened in the state of Louisiana to private schools that have chosen to participate in their school voucher program. So I want to present a sort of cautionary tale about the impact of regulations on different education sectors. The rules and regulations accompanying school choice programs and the supply of schools willing to participate, and that's important because it does impact the supply side in a very big way, and the ability of homeschooling families to educate their children as they see fit is something that is of paramount consideration when we think about how we write rules and regulations in the state. If your goal of homeschooling and school choice generally is indeed to expand the available options that exist when it comes to educating your children, understanding the impact of regulations is critically important. So as I mentioned, Louisiana serves as an instructive test case for what can happen when regulations are overly burdensome. Although I'm using the state's voucher program as an example, this lesson applies to homeschooling broadly and whether or not the state, capital S, should actually regulate homeschooling. So just by way of background, in 2008, the city of New Orleans, so New Orleans and Louisiana, implemented a school voucher program. And a few years later, and at the time it was available basically to kids who were low income and from underperforming public schools. So that was 2008. In 2012, the state decided to take the voucher program statewide so that all students who were in underperforming schools across the state of Louisiana could participate. When the program was expanded statewide, there were new regulations added to the voucher program. So we're talking about a voucher, right? Basically a coupon that the state funds to attend a private school of choice. However, in order for private schools to participate in the school voucher program, they had to agree to a litany of regulations. Now I'm going to fast forward, hopefully this will work, all the way to, all the way here. So in order for schools to participate, they had to agree to a litany of regulations. Schools, so private schools that want to accept kids who have a voucher as payment, have to take the state test, so the single statewide test in Louisiana. They have to use what they call open enrollment, so any child who wants to attend the private school has to allow that child to attend. Schools, private schools, have to report expulsions to the state. They have to report daily attendance to the state. And the voucher has to be considered payment in full to the school, so a parent cannot top off their voucher amount. So this is, I think this quote, I know it's a little difficult to see, but is really apt. And this is Astley and Van de Ven, who have done extensive work, seminal work in the field of organization theory. And so thinking a little bit about how organization theory applies to private school choice options, the player remains free, but if he wants to win, he must adopt a strategy in reasonable conformance with the rules, since a complete abandonment of the game cannot serve his interests. And so I think about this quote when I think about the impact regulations have had on private schools in Louisiana. These private schools have to play the game in order to participate. Otherwise, they leave tens of thousands of dollars on the table per child every year. And that's a significant amount of funding for these schools. So if these schools want to access funds, they have to incur and accept all of these regulations. But the question is, did they? Did these schools agree to adopt these regulations in order to access voucher money? And the answer is no, they didn't. As Brian Casita and Patrick Wolf and Evan Rinesmith have found, just one third of private schools in Louisiana participate in their voucher program. So again, these schools, the other 2/3, are effectively saying, thanks but no thanks. I do not want to incur your regulations. The tens of thousands of dollars per kid per year I would receive is not worth the red tape. Moreover, interviews with private school leaders who chose not to participate in the voucher program suggest that it was, in fact, those considerable regulations that led them to choose not to participate. School leaders who chose not to participate listed as their number one reason for non-participation fear of future regulations. I know it's hard to see, but that's that top line there. So this is a survey done by Patrick Wolf, Brian Casita, and Evan Reinsmith, asking school leaders why they chose not to participate in the voucher program. And that was their number one reason, fear of future regulations. And again, this is all out of Louisiana, out of their statewide voucher program. So another concern is that the private schools that were willing to participate and incur those many regulations were the private schools that were already experiencing enrollment declines before they entered the school voucher program. In other words, the private schools that chose to participate were maybe financially desperate beforehand. They were already bleeding students before they chose to participate. And so they were willing to incur those regulations, whereas private schools that were already on steady footing were not willing to incur those regs in order to participate. This, I would call, oppressive regulatory landscape might therefore be to blame for why we have the first ever random assignment evaluation of a school choice program that found negative impacts on the part of voucher use. So kids who used a voucher in Louisiana to attend a private school did worse than the control group of their non-user peers. I would hypothesize that it has everything to do with this oppressive regulatory landscape, that it has incentivized some of the most financially desperate private schools to participate. So I tell you all of this about Louisiana because I think Louisiana is a canary in a coal mine for regulations on homeschooling and the unintended consequences of regulation. And homeschooling is not immune to regulation. The Homeschool Legal Defense Association provides 4 what I think are really useful groupings of regulations on homeschool families. So according to the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, we have the first, states that require no notice whatsoever, this is in the US, that you will homeschool. So this is basically no regulation on homeschoolers. That's defined as having no requirement for parents to either initiate contact with the state or otherwise inform the state that they will homeschool. And then you have the next level of regulation, states with low regulation, which HSLDA defines as requiring parental notification of the decision to homeschool, but no additional reporting requirements. So still pretty low regulation. And then we have states with moderate regulation, defined as having a requirement for parents to send notification to the state that they are in fact homeschooling, as well as for a requirement for parents to submit student test scores to the state and or some type of evaluation of how their student's progressing. So that's what they define as moderate regulation. And then the fourth category, of course, heavy regulation. States with high regulation, HSLDA defines as requiring parents to notify the state that they are homeschooling and to send test scores to the state and or other evidence, evaluations of student progress, and in some states to have curriculum approved by the state, to acquire teacher credentials approved by the state, and to allow home visits on the part of state officials. This is clearly the high regulation states. So, of course, when we think about the impact of regulations, there are numerous exogenous factors that could impact why a family chooses to homeschool, right? Geography, the very awareness that homeschooling is an option, social economic status. There are many factors that can influence whether or not you choose to homeschool. However, regulations appear to have at least some impact on the rates of homeschooling state to state. Oops, sorry. So if we look here, so this is, if you look to the left, these are your high regulation states, and this is all according to HSLDA's framework of regulation. So high regulation states, your moderate regulation states, medium regulation states, moderate regulation states, and no regulation states. And you can see that the average percentage of homeschooling students by region, and sorry, the bottom of my chart got cut off there, But if you do the average of each of these, your high regulation states average about 2% of their school-age population homeschooling. So 2% of kids in high reg states homeschool, 3% of kids in moderate and low regulation states homeschool, and about 2.6% is the average there on the no regulation. So we don't have a good correlation between regulation and non-regulation, but I would point out that no state that is highly regulated has a homeschooling rate that's higher than the national average of homeschooling. And I would also add that the good news is that there are only 5 states in the US that are considered this high regulation environment. Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Vermont fall into that high regulation category on homeschooling. And it is these heavy-handed regulations on homeschooling in those 5 states that one fears would lead to isomorphism of practice, right? We tend to think homeschooling being the least susceptible to isomorphism, right? This idea that practices tend to look like other practices over time, again, borrowed from organization theory. And so if we look at the high regulation states, it's these states where the state is saying we want to approve your curriculum, we want to require that you have a teaching licensure, that maybe we even visit your home from year to year. Those are the types of regulations that one would think could lead to isomorphism of practice over time. And as such are some of the most onerous and some to clearly be avoided. So as Louisiana has shown, regulations can have a devastating impact on your freedom to educate, whether that is through school voucher programs or otherwise. And in order for homeschooling to continue to thrive, we need to be ever cognizant of the impact of regulations and make sure that the state keeps them to an absolute minimum. Thank you.
Can I have my... Okay, Lindsey, fantastic, thank you. It was excellent, very interesting. The point is, regulation, not so good. And so that's
Regs
what
are bad.
that's what I heard.
Very good.
I
That's
heard.
a great translation.
That's what I heard. Not so good. Regulation, not so good. So what we're going to do now, we are going to have a conversation. And I'd like to involve some of you. So if you have questions as we're going through this conversation, or even now if you have questions, if you could just jot a question down on a piece of paper, and maybe somebody could bring it up, or you could just bring it up here to me, and we'll get the panel involved. I'm going to bring up a couple of other people. I'd like to bring Sergio up here, and I'd also like to introduce another friend. Well, he's already been introduced, so you know who he is. I'd like to bring up Jan de Roof to come up and sit as well. Ingo, you've got to go down and present your other paper downstairs. Sorry to kick you out, but we're really using the intellectual capital we have here, and we're driving them very strongly. We're going to squeeze every ounce of intellectual capital you have out of you. Okay. So the topic of this discussion is the state's role in regulation, to regulate or to not regulate. And Jan and I were in a workshop earlier where we were talking about whether home education was a right, and and we all agreed that it was a right of some kind. And I guess the question I have is, okay, regardless of whether it's a right, but primarily if it is a right that people have, must the state regulate? May the state regulate? Should the state regulate? It's hard to say the state may not regulate because the state may do whatever it wants to do. It has the power to do what it wants to do. So really we have to talk about in the category of should the state regulate or must the state regulate. And I would, we can turn that off. Thanks, Lee. I would argue that while the state may regulate, it doesn't have to regulate. And as Lindsey pointed out, there are plenty of states in the United States where the state does not regulate at all. Now, in all of those states, the green states, I think we should just turn it off. Can we just turn it off? Tech guys, can we just turn it off? Just hit the power button. We're done after this. There are court decisions or there's a constitutional allowance of some kind. So the state has in some way regulated by choosing not to regulate. And I would say in the area of home education, this is a particularly appropriate response. And as I mentioned earlier, there are over a dozen states in America where legislatures have taken action to remove oversight and bureaucracy from homeschooling families. And in fact, I was involved in one just recently in West Virginia where we did a lot of things. We got rid of a prohibition on parents testing. We got rid of a waiting period before you could homeschool. It used to say you have to wait 10 days before you can homeschool, and we got rid of that. Instead of reporting to the superintendent every year, you only report one time. We got rid of, instead of sending in your assessment results every year from 12 times, we went down to 4 times in just grades 3, 5, 8, and 11, and a number of different other things. So it was really significant, and this has happened in a number of other states around the country in the United States. And when you look in Europe, Jan, I'd like to get you in on this. When you look in Europe and you look at the United Kingdom also does not regulate in terms of imposing oversight on homeschooling families. The law says you send your child to school or you educate them otherwise. Now, this has been something that the authorities there have become concerned about, and they've done things in the last 6 or 7 years to consider imposing regulation, but they have not done so. In the case of Germany, of course, Germany essentially completely outlaws home education. So I'd like to ask Jan to give us his thoughts, and then we'll come this way. Should the state regulate? May the state regulate? Must the state regulate? And if it does, if you think it should or must, to what extent should it or must it? Jan, what do you think?
Yeah, well, you know my statement, namely, according to the European Court, the state must regulate. The right to education calls, I'm quoting the first court decision, European Court decision on education. The right to education calls by its very nature for regulation by the state, regulation that will differ from time to place. That is the official statement of European Court, 66, first Belgian linguistic case.
Now, may I jump in on that for just a second? Because I'm very familiar with that case. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if context matters, because that was a case of access to education. And it was an issue of language and whether or not people who lived in one part of Belgium would be able to take their French-speaking children out of, I think, the Wallonish or Flemish region and then go to the French-speaking region. And the court said, well, I think they said you have to allow this access or something like that. But so does context come into play here? So I just wonder if you could maybe weave that into your conversation in terms of must regulate, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to you must regulate in certain areas, but maybe not in every area. And here in home education, we're talking about.
Yeah. But in principle, education is a co-responsibility, as you do remember. So from a negative freedom, it's also a positive entitlement to the state to make sure that education is available, is accessible, is adaptable, and is acceptable. And I'm adding a new UNESCO chair on this 4A, namely autonomy, 5th A, accountability, awareness of the right to education, and adequacy of education. So, but no time to go into detail. But yes.
So we're going from the 4 A's to the 8 A's.
Exactly.
I like it.
Yeah. And I do think that there is some state responsibility to making sure that education rights will be fulfilled. The question is, what means regulation? And I would highly appreciate, Lindsey, if you could give some details on the ranking regulation, because high regulation Does that mean, is that a quantitative approach or is it a qualitative approach? And no regulation at all, that's quite clear. But the second and the third rank, because is it just formal? Is it just superficial? Or is it content linked? That's the whole. And for instance, also on high regulation, is there any financial support for parents? Because that makes sense. The higher you will regulate, the more parents can rely on some financial support. But the question from European perspective is, how should be education regulated? That means that there are frontiers, there are limits to regulations. And the question is not anymore if, but the question is how. The if question is outdated, excuse me. But the how question is very vital. And standards or state regulations should respond to 4 norms, according to my research. First, state regulations should just deal with minimum standards. And minimum is not a maximum. Minimum is really minimum. That means what is really vital, essential, and according to the rule of proportionality, taking into account the goal. So there are some legal terms, I will not bother you too much with this. First, minimal goals. Secondly, each regulation should be broad consultation with society, with all stakeholders, with all providers, and with all interested groups, including homeschool defenders. Third, there are some domains where the state cannot regulate at all. Not dealing just with religion and with moral instruction, but also with didactics, specific educational methodology. So there are wide where the expert is not the minister, are not the bureaucrats, but are the teachers, is the staff. So the state is totally incompetent to regulate on some matters. And 4, there will always be room for alternatives. Alternatives who will reach similar goals like the attainment targets as I mentioned this morning. So there are 4 from my research. And I still hope to have some court decisions who will claim my 4 criteria as the Bible for state regulations. So it is not an if question, but it is a how question. And finally, there is some typology of states. Yes, throughout Europe, but that does not count just for Europe. You have highly centralized states. France is a good example, where the keyword is mistrust. The state mistrust schools and teachers and headmasters. So it is Paris who will regulate, detail all kind of aspects of. That is the bad example. Second example is at the opposite, is a highly decentralized system, like Great Britain. Local educational authorities, they do have the job also to regulate according to the principle of subsidiarity. I had the chance to write a book on subsidiarity in education, a very powerful principle. We should use that term, what is a Christian principle, as you do remember, after all. Subsidiarity.
Just a second. Subsidiarity is the term he's talking about.
Right. It is also a legal term. So, and there are kind of nice criteria to check if regulations are coping with that principle. I will not rename the term because I'm a European accent and not an American accent, I guess. Good. And then there is a third type of state regulation, namely the middle, the balanced, where there are some central basic norms and giving much autonomy to schools and eventually to regions. Voilà. I try to have some legal policy-linked approaches. But first, could you answer my specific question?
I will try, yeah. So your specific question was on the actual regs themselves, right? So So the low regulation states, they just say you have to inform us that you're going to be homeschooler, right? So then on the
Could I jump in?
So-
Could I jump in on that?
Yeah.
Because, well, the lowest regulation would be the no regulation, right?
I was saying the low reg states,
Right.
you just have to.
Okay,
Yeah. So the no regs, free for all. And I do think on the normative question that is where we should be. So on the moderate reg state for the outcomes, piece, you can take any, as I understand it, which you might know better than me, but any test fulfills that requirement. So any nationally norm reference test. So any test, and there are a handful of them. Iowa Test of Basic Skills would be an example. Even something like the SAT is an example of an NNR test. So you have a choice of tests that you can take in the moderate reg states. And then the high reg states, that as far as I know, aren't dictating yet what tests you have to take. They've just added on the additional layers of you have to take a test, you have to report to the state, you have to have a teaching license. We might come in and check out what you're doing at home. But in terms of the outputs. Now, on the normative question of should states be regulating, I think it was Maria's presentation earlier. Was yours the one where you said, what about socialization of homeschoolers, right? So this question always comes up, well, how are these homeschooled kids going to be well socialized? And you had a quote that you had in your slide that said, well, walk down any typical middle school classroom today and show me what you want your kid to be imitating and emulating, right? I mean, this idea, right? So I kind of think about regulations the same way that you think about socialization. For 150 years, our public schools have been highly, highly regulated. And how are they doing? Not very well, exactly. I mean, you look at all of these outputs and outcomes that we have in the US at least. Reading achievement has been flat for the past 4 decades. Mathematics achievement's flat. We're not competitive internationally. Graduation rates have only nudged up ever so slightly. But if you're a disadvantaged child, graduation rates have been flat since the 1970s. I mean, we have nothing to show for all of the regulations that we layer onto the public
Actually,
school monopoly.
If I could, Lindsay, I would just jump in and say we have lots to show.
Well,
We
okay,
have
red
a
tape.
huge debt of money that we owe because we have increased our spending about tenfold.
So and what we have to show for that increased spending is, if I think one of my favorite data points, if you look at the US public education system today, the number of teachers to non-teachers in 1950, so if you go back to 1950 and you look at your typical school district in the US, there were 2.36 teachers for every non-teacher. And today it's 1 to 1. So in your typical American school district, in every district you look at, every teacher you see has an administrative non-teacher counterpart. That's where the money's going, is to all of the administrative bloat. So to answer your question really tangentially about the normative idea of regulating, I think it should be as low, if any, as possible, because it is inappropriate to layer on the regs that haven't even worked for monopoly onto the private sector, which I would extend to homeschooling.
I want to ask a question. We'll start with Sergio because it comes into the question I asked Jan, but we have a question from the audience here, which I think is very appropriate for this particular question of to regulate or not regulate. So the question is, what is the difference between the duty of parents to provide physical nutrition for their children or medical care, for example, and the duty to provide intellectual care? Is this an appropriate analogy? Would we not consider it absurd, or maybe we wouldn't, to make laws regulating the diet and food choices of the family or requiring that every child go to a doctor every 6 months? So isn't it also kind of silly to regulate such other aspects of child care which have been assigned to parents? So can I start with Sergio? And then we'll make our way over to you, Jan. Yeah.
Well, the answer to that question comes precisely to where I wanted to get, because no regulation is ideal as long as you have recognition, which is a word that usually comes into the equation. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's related. In several countries, it's Brazil, Mexico, Spain, we don't have regulation, but we don't have recognition either. So no regulation is fantastic and idealistic or ideal as long as everybody understands that homeschooling is all right and you have the right to do it. And with feeding your children, there's no doubt. I mean, everybody understands that you have the recognition of the right to feed your children and decide what you feed your children. But with homeschooling, no. So that's a problem we have in Spain, and I have this discussion with my fellows in Spain. Shall we get recognition? They say no, because once we get recognition, we'll have regulation. For now, we do what we want. Say, well, we do what we want as long as you're not detected, because when you're detected, you go into court, and you don't have the tool to say, hey, I'm doing this. Okay? So for many countries, no regulation at all is not ideal. It's best to have something, recognition and then regulation, and from then go step by step towards freedom, like they have in Ireland, they have in Great Britain or the United States.
I would not. I would take Ireland out of that equation, because Ireland, even though they have a constitutional right to do it, they don't have as much freedom, we would say, as you do, even though you don't have recognition, because no one's looking over your shoulder, whereas in Ireland, they have a very burdensome law that they have to comply with in order to comply with, the constitutional, the Constitution. So
I thought
it's
the
Great Britain.
recognition
Great
in
Britain is the
Constitution of the
example in
region.
Europe of no regulation. Great Britain is the green state of Europe.
Education otherwise, huh?
Education
That's-
otherwise.
That was my answer.
Yeah. So the question is, Lindsey, what about this analogy here? We don't regulate what children eat, although some people have wanted to, like Michelle Obama, right, wants to,
had to go there.
And I did have to go there. And also, Michael Bloomberg, who says you're not allowed to have a 20-ounce soda in New York City. So you just buy 2 10 ounces, I mean, what is this? This is silly, isn't it?
Yeah,
What do you think?
Look, and you've seen all the stories, right, of kids throwing their lunches out, and it is when you've got the state regulating food. I think maybe the more apt analogy, and one on which I am not remotely qualified to speak, is the analogy of vaccination. Don't even want to open up that can of worms, but I think that that's probably a more apt analogy, because you do have whatever side of it that you're on. The folks who, will say that, well, it does have an impact community-wide, and so therefore should be regulated. So I think that that's maybe more an apt analogy than the food analogy. But again,
So the idea
not
is that
remotely qualified to talk about
so you're saying vaccinations, or I mean, it's not. I think we can go there. So you're talking about the idea that vaccinations, immunizations, medical care, that's a form of medical care that we regulate.
Correct.
We don't
because it has
regulate
a
other.
community
We don't
impact.
regulate other medical care usually, but we regulate some states. Most states regulate
Most states, in
vaccinations,
order to enroll in a
immunizations.
school, require some
Right,
level of
and
immunization.
there's often a requirement that you vaccinate, but in all states in the U.S. except for 2, there are exemptions for religious or philosophical or conscientious reasons. And so, the point being, we allow exceptions for conscientious reasons in that area. Why not also in the other area?
Of homeschooling.
Homeschooling
Yeah, and I
or
think-
in education, for example.
In education generally, I think that's what we do, right? I mean, you have the option to enroll in a traditional public school if you want, but then, if you're one of the, and I still think at this point in the U.S. at least, it is an exception of families who, not even homeschooling, but private school choice, right? If we look at the market or the landscape that's out there, we've got about 90% of kids who are still in traditional public schools today. So I do think that private school choice and homeschooling is the wonderful exception, though, to the rule that exists today. So I do think it's still a small part of the market. The only other thing I would say on that, I think Sergio started to get to a point of information, and we hear this all the time, right? How are parents going to know what are good options, what options exist? And I have become so excited about how much information's out there on the supply of available schooling options. Now, all of a sudden, thanks in large part to the ubiquity of the internet, but all of a sudden, we have private rating services. If you've ever looked at U.S. private schools, you can go to something called greatschools.org that rates private schools. There are all of these private sector rating entities that exist today that provide more information than a parent could ever want or need on schooling options that are out there. So I do put a lot of stock in the free market in order to regulate and to provide the information that parents will ultimately need down the road.
Thanks. Three remarks. First, in the Belgian linguistic case, what's not dealing just with language legislation, but also the court made some global remarks. And one of the global remarks was, yes, education is the prior responsibility of the parents, And as I mentioned this morning, that responsibility is of natural law. You understand my English? Yes? It is not American. It's just natural law. There are not that many court decisions where natural law is used in a court decision, right?
At least in Europe.
So, it is. So it is an overall responsibility. You cannot just split it up in different sectors. It is an overall responsibility. And quoting, well, the Campbell and Cousins case versus UK, that's dealing with corporal punishment, the ban of corporal punishment. Also the Gelsenbusk, Madison, and Pedersen case versus Denmark on sex education. The court made very, very clear that homeschooling, home education can be a very acceptable and worthy alternative. No doubt about that. So that was totally in contradiction with the German case, 2, 3 German cases of that same court. But I had not the time to read very short sentence of the court. So the court decided the Danish state allows parents either to entrust their children to private schools, which are bound by less strict obligations, and whatever heavily subsidized by the state, or to educate them or have them educated at home. So it is a choice, or state regulated to some extent, or parents or at home. And then the court added a quite interesting and intriguing reflection, I quote, educated at home, subject to suffering the undeniable sacrifices and inconveniences caused by recourse to one of those alternative solutions. In the workshop, I paid honor for parents who have the commitment, the engagement to school, to educate their children at home. I even added the French term chapeau, head off, because he's asking professionalism, commitment, continuity during many years. It requires sacrifices who will reflect trust, that's my position, trust from the state to the parents in a very prominent way. So, but there is legal reasoning within the European Court who should be nuanced, to use another term. Second idea, I had a chance to work with the Russian legislature, with the Duma, and with the minister of the Russian government on draft school law after the collapse of the USSR in the 90s, from 92 to 2000. And because the Minister Zeprov, and after Zeprov it was Tkachenko, Kinelov, and Filipov, those the 4 ministers of education and research, asked us to lead a panel of experts on drafting new legislation, because if the state will not be able to regulate correctly education, the transition of the USSR to Russia will fail, I quote. But once I was in an audience with the Minister of Education and of Finance, of the budget, and I was provoking the Minister of Budget Finance, because budget cuts were quite dramatic into the education sector. And I said, well, Minister, and I talked to the Minister of Budget, you are apparently the Minister of Education, because you are deciding what's all about education finance. And the minister responded me, Professor, education freedom stops when subsidization finance is larger than 0. I said, well, this is a typical communist, Marxist ideology. The idea, my doctrine, my European approach is, and I will limit it to this quote, self-quote, namely, freedom of could be freedom for something. But I have to be shortened. So third idea is, yes, there are good practices. And to remember, several European constitutions and constitutions worldwide do guarantee homeschooling in the constitution. And in the majority of European member states, also the broad Europe, Council of Europe, 48 states, the majority allows homeschooling. So do not narrowly be frustrated by the German case. There are many other, and again, I have criticized this morning of the, quite heavily the legal reasoning of the court. But there are good practices. And the best practices are reaching the balance between good regulation and autonomy and freedom. So again, I'm shocking some of you, I know, but I like to provoke sometimes. The if question is finished. The what question and the how question is much more powerful and enabling much more parents to fulfill their responsibility and to enable kids from a certain age to fulfill attainment targets and educational goals. Sorry to be too long.
Oh, no, thank you so much, Jan.
Can I just say, I don't think the if
Yeah,
question
please.
is finished in the U.S.
I was going to say the same thing. Go ahead. Yeah, no, you go.
That's all.
You do it, Lindsay.
I just don't think the if question is settled.
No, it's not settled at all. In fact, we are pushing back against regulation, and that's what I said. When we have 12 states, we're peeling back. Now, I don't know that we'll ever get to the point where we can peel back the final shred, the final film of notification, which is not, I mean, honestly, it's not unreasonable to just write a little piece of paper and send it in and say, we're homeschooling, leave us alone. In some respects, it actually, one could argue that it actually is better, because then you don't have questions of truancy and things like that. It's just you fulfilled your legal responsibility to notify the state that you are doing what you have a right to do so that they leave you alone. You know, it's like although I prefer no regulation myself, but just in case there's anybody wondering out there, okay? But I understand this argument about, some regulation. But we're in Brazil. Jan, we're in Brazil, and they're grappling with this as a first instance question. Why should we give up on the if question in Brazil? Why? Alexandre, why aren't you up here? Come up here. Come up here. Go ahead. No, well, let's hear what Alexandre says, and then you can tell us what you think.
No, don't worry. Well, here in Brazil, we have a factual situation that must be considered. It's that the tragic state of our education and in the international evaluations. Oh, it's been translated. I can speak in Portuguese.
Yeah, you can. You can speak in Portuguese, but I need to get that.
Just 1 second.
Okay. Okay.
That's very kind. Thank you so much. Oh, yeah. Ladies first.
Okay.
Ok. Eu acho que nós temos que considerar dois fatores no Brasil. O primeiro deles é o trágico estado da educação brasileira. Aqui nós estamos falando de uma das piores educações do mundo, medidas por avaliações internacionais. Geralmente não, sempre, nós ficamos entre os últimos lugares nessas avaliações internacionais, por exemplo, a PISA. Isso significa um fracasso retumbante da regulação e da atuação estatal brasileira na educação. Essa situação factual não pode ser desprezada dentro da análise jurídica. Seria bastante diferente se estivéssemos discutindo isso num país em que a educação provida pelo Estado ou regulada pelo Estado fosse de excelente qualidade. Aqui nós temos exatamente a situação contrária. Isso, no meu entender, é um fortíssimo argumento contra a regulamentação. Para ser mais exato, por menor regulamentação. E aí nós estamos discutindo se deve regulamentar ou não. E, nesse ponto, eu sou forçado a concordar com o professor que essa questão não se aplica ao Brasil, não apenas por conta de nossa Constituição, mas por conta de nossa aderência aos tratados internacionais, de que, sim, o Estado deve regular a educação. Inclusive, um dos artigos da nossa Constituição fala expressamente quais são os deveres do Estado com relação à educação. E um deles é definir parâmetros mínimos de qualidade. Então, alguma regulamentação deve haver e nós não podemos escapar disso. Mas a questão é a seguinte, nós temos essa regulamentação em vários níveis, federal, estadual, local. Nós temos a regulamentação dentro das próprias escolas e o resultado tem sido este que nós conhecemos. Então, eu gostaria de retornar a palavra mencionada várias vezes aqui, que é a confiança. Muita regulamentação simboliza uma relação de desconfiança do Estado para com a sociedade, especialmente, no nosso caso aqui, para com as famílias. Então, sim, juridicamente nós não temos opção, o Estado deve regulamentar. Mas essa regulamentação, ela deve ser baseada no princípio da confiança. Na verdade, se deve haver alguma desconfiança aqui no Brasil, é das famílias com relação ao Estado, não do Estado com relação às famílias, já que o Estado não cumpriu a sua função. Agora, definir exatamente como deve ser feita essa regulação é, como eu diria, a pergunta de $1 milhão. Não há resposta óbvia para isso. No meu entender, essa regulamentação deveria dizer respeito à definição de parâmetros mínimos, isso está na nossa Constituição, parâmetros mínimos bastante genéricos que devem ser ensinados às crianças, e uma avaliação de resultados, como vocês disseram aqui, de outcomes. Isso, por incrível que pareça, já é feito aqui no Brasil. Eu estava conversando com o Mike e com o professor mais cedo, que nós temos testes padronizados, tanto para o ensino fundamental quanto para o ensino médio, e esses testes, eles são hábeis a dar certificado de conclusão do ensino fundamental e do ensino médio, mesmo aqueles que nunca frequentaram a escola. E isso aí é uma espécie de supervisão, de regulamentação estatal. Então, pode ser a medida certa. Mas eu serei bastante sincero com os senhores. Eu não sei traçar exatamente essa medida. O que eu posso dizer com certeza absoluta é que o modo como tem sido feito no Brasil nas últimas décadas, o nosso Ministério da Educação é de 1930 aproximadamente, não funciona, não deu certo. E precisamos buscar alternativas, principalmente alternativas para aquelas famílias que discordam do modelo hegemônico. É isso.
Please. Yes, please, Jan, please.
Very, very brief. Couldn't we not reach a consensus on the Rio triangle of three notions? First, dealing with home education, but also with a broader education policy. The Rio triangle. First, state intervention and regulation, if there is any, should be limited to core norms, to the core obligation and to core norms, first. Secondly, educational freedom as a basic norm of all education policy and constitutional and international law, education freedom. And home education is a vital aspect of education freedom. And 3, there is a quite interesting legal term in jurisprudence and in law, school law, namely in loco parentis. A school teacher is only acting in loco parentis, on behalf of the parent. It's a very powerful, it's a legal term. Mm-hmm. It's a powerful notion, in loco parentis. Because you cannot deny that the big majority of parents are not capable, are not willing, are not committed to home education. But if there is a willingness to do so, the choice, the parent can remake his choice. So the teacher, the school is acting in loco parentis. So the Rio triangle, isn't that nice? Should we vote? We agree, yes.
I think you are onto something, Jan. I've drafted a little triangle here. I'm not sure in loco parentis fits on one of the corners, but I put trust in the middle.
Yes.
But I do get what you're pointing at, which is, if the schools are in loco parentis, if the parents keep them home to educate them at home, then there is no in loco parentis. It is just parentis. Yeah, I get your point. It's a very good point. Go ahead, Lindsay.
To make your stool much more wobbly, I'm going to have to disagree with one of your legs, which was the first leg, which was this idea of a core, standards, or what's the core?
Well, the core is, the term core obligation is a well-known term in international law. Core obligation of the state, according to international law. The core obligation is to enable the child to reach attainment targets, education goals, fulfilling his right of education. That's the core.
So I want to go ahead, Lindsay.
So I was just going to say, so I think that's the problem, right? Because in the US, we have just gone through a hotly contested debate over Common Core, which was a minimum set of standards. This idea that you can set a minimum set of standards on which everyone agrees, we saw that fall apart really quickly, and for good reason. It should have never happened in the first place.
Amen.
And so I think this is where we see a little bit of disagreement, right? It's on the question of
allow me to...
One second. For that reason, the legislator in Louisiana was that stupid to ask for daily reports from private schools. They did so. But anyway, a nation at risk, Charlottesville, Virginia campus. Remember? 50 governors making quite clear that US system was falling down on math, reading, and science, right? The 3 was substandard. American students were substandard vis-a-vis international test scores. Substandard. So there should be a commitment on education attainment targets, on goals, what should be known by students to be competitive, to be enabled to go for higher education on science, reading and maths, for instance. So that are some of the goals of the attainment targets. I guess it is in the interest...
But that's more than the core.
Well, no,
right?
but the question is what is the core? According to my opinion, minimum is the minimum.
And it's really minimum. See, the common core, you sound like Marco Rubio. The common core, I'm not Donald Trump. The common core, though, is not a minimum set of standards. It is a comprehensive set of standards. And that's where there's a difference between what you're saying. He's saying the minimum is really a minimum.
Although the common core people would say it's a minimum set of standards.
Yeah, blah, blah, whatever. Ridiculous. Yeah,
agree, they would say
it's totally ridiculous. So I know they say that, but he means a different kind of, I think, a different kind of minimum to what you're suggesting.
No, I agree.
But here's my question.
A couple times we've heard about this minimum standards idea.
We're having fun up here. Erwin Fabian. Okay, just 1 minute. I just want to throw one thing out here because here's the crux of the issue. Sergey, you're gonna have to jump in here if you want to get in on this. You're gonna have to be more aggressive. The question is, can't the state just not regulate unless there is a failure. So it's not a question of imposing a minimum standard, but observing whether the minimum standard is not being met and then intervening. Why do we have to have positive, proactive regulation? Why not just we intervene only if there is a breakdown? That's the question. So I'd like to ask Erwin to ask his question, and then we'll come to Lee, and then we're going to have to end up. It is 5:28. We have 2 minutes. 2 minutes. We're going to go a little bit longer, but after this, there will be more time for networking and discussion, but I would like to go a little further. If you have to leave, feel free to leave. If you want to be entertained a little bit more, stick around. Can someone bring him a microphone or come up here, Erwin? Yeah, why don't you bring it to him? And they have a translation, so put your headset on. He's going to speak Spanish, Jan. Oh, you speak
Gracias.
Spanish.
Yo tengo la sensación, voy a transmitir una sensación que tengo, y es que cuando hablan ahora de esas tres partes del triángulo, siento, y lo digo con profundo respeto, que son miradas que siguen siendo muy adultocéntricas. O sea, como que esas tres patas de ese triángulo son excesivamente pensadas de la cosmovisión adultocéntrica. A mí me parece que ha habido un esfuerzo muy grande en el mundo para elaborar normas para la protección de los derechos de los niños y las niñas. Yo estoy de acuerdo con la mínima reglamentación y las mínimas normas posibles en los temas de que estamos hablando, y vale la pena que tal vez, además de hablar de ese triángulo, hablemos de un cuadrado que tenga un elemento fundamental, que son los derechos de los niños y las niñas. O sea, creo que es un aspecto fundamental que deberíamos tener permanentemente presente en las discusiones sobre la educación sin escuela, los derechos de los niños y las niñas que están bastante establecidos en las normas internacionales que han sido acogidas por la mayoría de los países.
It is so evident. The starting point is, of course, the best interest of the child.
Oh,
No doubt about it. So this triangle, well, just an idea. But I was thinking on it, just talking with this wonderful lady on the triangle, on the Rio Triangle. Now, the starting point is exclusively what is in the best interest of the child. How to fulfill the right to education. Through education, freedom, parental choice, and a limited intervention and regulation by the state. Voilà. So, but the starting point is all start with the kids, their interest, and trust indeed.
Okay. And Sergey, do you want to make a comment on any of this? Okay. Lee, go ahead. What's your question? Is it turned on? There's a little switch on the side there. Flip it up or down or something.
So in the United States, we have a principle I hold very dear, and it's that you are innocent until proven guilty. And as a parent, when I get regulations on what I have to do with my child, you're automatically assuming I'm going to be a criminal and I'm not going to do the very best for my family. And I resent it, and it's immediately an inherent robbing of my freedom and of our family's ability to be what they need to be and to do what they need to do.
So this is
Not
an
a question,
excellent,
it's a comment.
It's an excellent observation, Jan. Doesn't this idea of whether or how regulation get to the very heart of subsidiarity? I mean, if we really believe in subsidiarity, shouldn't we be saying there shouldn't be regulation? You wrote the book on subsidiarity. I want to hear what you have to say about it,
Yep.
but Sergio's got the
No,
microphone, so
just
we'll
a
let him
quick
go
thing.
first.
It just is related with what I said in my speech before, and it's when we came out of the dictatorship in Spain in 1978, we made sure that the liberties were liberties. So the statement of liberties in our constitution is very clear, and there is no law to regulate those liberties. There's no law to regulate the liberty of expression, which there was in the Franco regime. There's no law to regulate the right to associate or to reunion, because there's trust and there's the convincement by the authorities and the people that made the constitution that there should be no limits to these liberties. But it's strange with education. Everybody thinks that there should be limits and there should be extreme limits and regulations and everything. So when I hear about this regulation and the core of different norms to regulate education, I always think, why is this exception with education and not with other liberties? Yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
And where? Yeah, well, in one chapter in the book I published with Charles Glenn, what is the best competitors on earth on education? He's American. He's speaking 5, 6 European languages, by the way, much more than we do. Yeah, but, well, still he pretended to be American citizen. Yeah. We wrote a chapter on terminology, on the doctrine of the state. And do know that there is exactly a uniform terminology on education and of state-oriented education system by the Nazis, the fascists, and the communists, the Marxists. They're using exactly the same terms, notions. It should be the state, the nation, who will educate. The state definitely will not educate. Is that clear? But on the other side, so, and again, from comparative constitutional perspective, that counts for South Africa, where I had the chance to work during 10 years with the legislator, counts for Russia, counts for different non-democratic states who made a transition to a democracy. No reliable democracy can be credible without education freedom. It's from constitutional comparative research, it's quite clear. The weak point is always situated in schools. And for that reason, one of my statements is, you will never reach consensus in a society, pacification in a society, if you cannot create consensus in educational policy, and if possible, school peace. I was chargé de mission, special envoy for UNESCO on right to education. I organized a top meeting with top leadership in the Palestinian territories and with Israeli, and it was all about consensus, cooperation, coexistence. The weakest point was schools, education. So education freedom is the cornerstone of democracy. That's clear? That's my second statement. So the state shall not educate. And education freedom is the cornerstone for democracy. But I am not a believer in mistrust community and society. This negative interpretation, no state, and I will be happy. That is not my understanding of freedom. And I agree, American way of life is something with specific, for Europeans, a quite problematic relation with the positive. Because, again, read research on the evolution of the right to education from a negative perspective to entitlement. The state has to enable parents and schools to do their job, to take up their responsibility. So, so education freedom, so the state will not educate, but will trust teachers, professionals, and schools, who are the real professionals, and give much autonomy, responsibility, and accountability to local authorities. And after all, as the first partner, namely the parent, because that's where it starts all education process in all evidence. So sorry, I was again too late, a little bit too sentimental, but lawyers, professors of law can become sentimental, as you can imagine.
Jan, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much. You know, and this puts into the discussion, and we don't have time for it, the whole idea of rights. Are rights negative or rights positive? You know, from the U.S. perspective, there are no positive rights. Rights are not positive, rights are negative. We have a constitution, we have a limited government, we have a federal republic. At the national level, there are no rights, although there are, under the Constitution, positive ones. At the state level, rights, again, not positive. The state may undertake action, but it's not in furtherance of a right, even though all states in the United States have said that education is a right. That does not mean you have to do it. And so this is a question we don't have time for. I'd like to talk with you about, though, this whole idea of compulsory education as a right. Because to me, it's fundamentally inconsistent and nonsense to talk about a right as compulsory. This is a question. You can't answer it right now. I want to thank you for being here. Now we have networking, affinity groups, and there is on the door a list of the locations for the affinity groups, which will go from now until 7 p.m. Okay, Chandri, thank you so much. Here are my announcements. I didn't know where I put them. Thank you. Dinner is at 1900. Please go to an affinity group of some kind to meet new people who have a common regional connection to you. In here, there's going to be mostly the Brazilians. So Brazil, you will be up here. So if you're Brazilian and you're going to network, come up here. Alexandria is going to facilitate along with his colleagues. North Americans, if you're North American, that would mean U.S. or Canada. We're going to meet in the back because there's far fewer of us. Researchers, if you are a researchers are going to go down to the Atlanta room on the first floor. Africa and Asia Pacific, you can get together or split up, whatever you want to do. California, Brazil's in here, and in San Diego, Europeans in San Diego. So, thank you. Please thank our lively panel here, and please make your way to your networking location, and we'll see you at dinner at 7 p.m., 1900. Thank you so much.